Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I am joined in the studio today by no one, but I will be joined via Skype, by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, my friend, who is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. His family comes from Syria. And Dr. Jasser is a strong advocate for the separation of mosque and state, which is something that I do a lot of work with as far as separation of church and state, separation of synagogue and state in my own work. And I look forward to talking to Dr. Jasser both about the impact of that within the United States and also around the world. But for sure, we'll talk a good bit about Syria today because that is what is on everybody's mind, and Iran as well. Let's not forget Iran. We'll talk a little bit. I want to talk a little bit in my World in 5 Minutes segment here about the UN General Assembly. One bit of good news that happened at the UN General Assembly is that Omar Bashir, the president of Sudan, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for genocide, has decided not to come to speak at the UNGA, primarily because there are riots going on in the streets in Khartoum and all across the country because of mismanagement of the government, to be perfectly honest. Subsidies that were being given for gasoline and oil have been taken away. The government simply can't afford to do that anymore. The government of Sudan has largely been bribing its population for years now while abusing other parts of its population, and it was able to do that because of its oil revenues. Those oil revenues were lost to South Sudan. South Sudan took most of the oil revenue with it, most of the oil fields with it when it seceded. And so the government really can't afford to continue to do what it has been doing to pay off its people to make them happier. In President Obama's speech at the UN General Assembly this week, he has focused specifically on the situation with Iran and the situation with Syria. We'll talk a little bit about the situation with Syria when Dr. Jasser is with us. I wanted to make a particular comment about how President Obama looked at the Iranian situation. And he has said that he wants to resolve the U.S. relationship with Iran peacefully, resolve our concerns with Iran's nuclear program peacefully. And specifically, he pointed at the fact that Iran appears to be headed in that direction as well, trying to find a peaceful path forward. We hope that that is true. Okay, none of us hope for any kind of a military option in Iran in any fashion, even if it's limited strikes against nuclear facilities. We don't want that under any circumstances. No one wants to resort to military action if it's not needed. And the president pointed out that the supreme leader, this would be Ayatollah Khomeini, has issued a fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons, meaning a religious dictum against the development of nuclear weapons, and that President Rouhani, the newly elected president of Iran, has just recently reiterated that the Islamic Republic will never develop a nuclear weapon. Now, if those are both true, we're in great shape. The problem is trusting that. And the president says that I'm trying to find the exact wording here as I am looking at here we go. The president said, so these statements made by our respective governments should offer the basis for a meaningful agreement. We should be able to achieve a resolution that respects the rights of the Iranian people, namely the right to access nuclear energy. That's really the right he's talking about there, while giving the world confidence that the Iranian program is peaceful. But to succeed, conciliatory words will have to be matched by actions that are transparent and verifiable. After all, it's the Iranian government's choices that have led to this to the comprehensive sanctions that are currently in place. A friend of mine, was talking about the fact that Rouhani is moderate and all of these things. Moderate compared to what? And this is a really big issue. I think we'll talk to Dr. Jasser about it too, because I think he has his own opinions of what qualifies as a moderate versus not, and I think he and I are largely in agreement. But my basic application of what qualifies as a moderate is somebody who doesn't believe in oppressing people's freedom of speech, and doesn't believe in oppressing people's freedom of religion. And I think that anyone who does those, if someone is arresting people for speaking words that they don't want to hear, if they're arresting people who are practicing a faith that they don't believe in, or preventing them actively from practicing their faith, even in private, but certainly in public in many cases, or are taking action such as executing people for saying things they don't agree with, or practicing a religion they don't believe in, then we run into real radicalism in my mind. And it doesn't matter what faith we're dealing with, whether we're dealing with the forcible application of atheism, or we're dealing with Christian traditions, Islamic traditions, or even the extremist Jews who would like to oppose those kind of views on few people. And admittedly, there are very few Jews. I only say that reluctantly, because it often is, just lump everybody together and they're radicals of all different populations. Well, the percentage of radicals in populations is also important. And the percentage of Jewish radicals who would qualify in those categories is much, much smaller than the percentage of people in other traditions, certainly in other countries, who would qualify in that category. Okay, there are entire nations that have laws that prevent freedom of speech and prevent freedom of religion. And there are governments that have gone out of their way to arrest people or even execute people for those practices. Iran is one of those countries. We're talking about systematic oppression here, meaning that anybody who is supported by the governmental system within those countries cannot be called a moderate, because they're supporting those systems. If Rouhani came out and said, I don't believe in oppressing people because of freedom of speech or arresting people, and actually took action to prevent the government from doing that, then you could say that he's not a radical. Okay, that would be my definition. Okay, those who are radicals in Israel, for example, are not in governmental positions, at least that radical. You could say there are people who have positions in other places. But when you look at Egypt, when you look at Turkey, where you also have people being arrested, when you look at Egypt, I mentioned Egypt already, Tunisia, Libya, when you look at the Palestinian Authority, which arrests people for criticizing the government, these are places where those freedoms are not guaranteed, and the leaders are taking radical positions. And so, for me, when we're talking about somebody being a moderate, that's my definition of moderate. And if you don't meet that definition of moderate, we're talking apples and oranges here. We're not in the same category. When we get back from a short break, hopefully Dr. Jasser will be joining us very shortly. This has been the World in 5 minutes, or World in 8 minutes, with Rabbi David Kaufman.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershide.
I'm administrative manager.
I'm the senior technician
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're going to do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's going to be a good experience for you, or else it's free. What type of work do you think we're going to do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you going to say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're going to be listening. They're going to want to know what your challenges are. Then they're going to come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me. But is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going, though. I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm going to take all the risks.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'd like to thank our sponsor of the show, Dr. Ronald Bergman of Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, for their continued support of this show and enabling us to bring on wonderful guests like Dr. Jasser, who will be joining us in just a few moments. I wanted to just give you a brief introduction to who Dr. Jasser is before we move on. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is a medical doctor, he is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, AIFD. You can find it at aifdemocracy.org online. He is a devout Muslim, and he founded AIFD in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the United States as an effort to provide an American Muslim voice advocating for the preservation of the founding principles of the United States Constitution, liberty and freedom through the separation of mosque and state. He is a first-generation American Muslim whose parents fled the Ba'ath regime of Syria in the mid-1960s for American freedom. And he, according to the AIFD website here, he is leading the fight to shake the hold that the Muslim Brotherhood and their network of American Islamic organizations and mosques seek to exert on organized Islam in America. Dr. Jasser earned his medical degree in the U.S. Navy with a scholarship at the Medical College. And he served, Medical College of Wisconsin, actually. He served 11 years as a medical officer in the U.S. Navy. And he can talk a little bit more about that when he comes on. I was talking briefly about Rouhani and Iran and dealing with U.S. negotiations. And there are a couple of things that happened at the UNGA over the last, really yesterday. Rouhani came forward with what would be a more conciliatory tone, willingness to negotiate. He also was reported to have said things that came off, in public at least, as if he were supporting the idea that the Holocaust actually happened, that large numbers of Jews were actually killed by the Nazis. Now, while we take this to be a fact, and we would respond, of course it did, knowing our history, in Iran this is a big deal because Iran has practiced Holocaust denial for many years, and particularly under Ahmadinejad and its state policy. So it was reported that Rouhani had said that these things actually happened to Jews, and he was condemning genocide against the Jews and anybody else. And the state media actually came out and questioned whether or not his statement should be translated that way, that historical events was the accurate translation and not genocide. Dr. Jasser is now on with us. Dr. Jasser, I'd like to welcome you to Understanding the World. It's wonderful to have you on with me today.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you, Rabbi.
So I gave a little bit of an introduction to your background and to AIFD. I got to put my headset on here so I can hear you a little bit better. I don't know where we should start. There are a lot of different possible places that we can begin, whether we're talking about Syria, Iran, or we talk about what AIFD does itself. And I thought maybe I would just throw that open to you. Where would you like to start?
Well, I think, it's easy sometimes to compartmentalize everything and look at Syria by itself, Egypt by itself, look at American threats on our soil of domestic terrorism. And I think let's start simple and look at the fact that I would tell you that since 9/11, we formed our organization, and we are looking to get a consensus in America that the commonality that ties all of these threats is political Islam, and that ultimately, just like in the Cold War, the Soviets were a byproduct of an imperialistic desire for communism around the world. In the Soviet version of that, the current threat, the new Cold War, if you will, is the conflict between liberty or secular liberal democracies versus Islamist governments that believe that the government should be run by Islamic law, that clerics ultimately develop law, and that the legal systems and politics don't run by reason, but rather by a sense of scriptural exegesis. So that is in the context of what I think is the root cause of the symptom of al-Qaeda or terrorism, if you will. And the change in the Arab awakening is basically the removal of the pressure cooker in which you had this stew brewing in every country where dictatorships, monarchs in Saudi Arabia or Egyptian dictatorships with Sadat, Mubarak, or Nasser before them, that brewed this stew of radicalization. You remove the pressure cooker, the vacuum gets filled by Islamists, the West remains asleep, and our organization really has been trying to show our government and show the West that there are ways in which moderate Muslims, in which the majority should be woken up to fill that vacuum, not by the Islamists that have been brewed in this stew of autocracy, where they conveniently have been the foil for dictators that have been used to legitimize emergency law and martial law in most of these countries. But ultimately, that if you look in Egypt, for example, you had masses demonstrate against the dictatorship of Mubarak, and then a year later, you have even 10 times more of the masses demonstrate against the Brotherhood. So for all those who think that in Islam it's in the Muslim DNA to be run by theocracy or by Islamists, I think recently Egypt has proved that differently. And I think Syria, we can talk about that specifically, is that same paradigm, in that it's not only a binary choice between two evils, but rather there is a third choice, and it's the masses of the people.
I know I had Dr. Walid Fares on the show a couple of weeks ago, who talked about the fact that there was a third way, the Free Syrian Army and people who we could potentially work with as moderates in Syria. But it seems like now that the Muslim Brotherhood and the al-Qaeda affiliates have really been gaining steam. In fact, even attacked at one point, I think last week, a village on the Lebanese border that was being controlled by the Free Syrian Army, and al-Qaeda attacked the rebel group.
Absolutely. And Rabbi, the issue that we're missing here is that Syria is not a two-front war, as the Wall Street Journal reported last week. It's a three-front war. And our allies are certainly not the Assadists who claim to be secularists that are going to protect minorities. But if anybody can prove to me how a regime that's in bed with the Iranian theocracy, that's in bed with Hezbollah, is somehow protective of minorities, I just don't get that. And ultimately, the Jewish population, I think, all over the Middle East can speak to the fact that these dictators are certainly not safe havens for minorities. There are no Jews left in Egypt or barely in Syria. And I think, ultimately, if you look it's a three-front war in Syria, and that third front, unfortunately, has not gotten the means, the finances, the weapons, and you're left with this Darwinian evolution in that we were calling in our organization and in groups that have been working not only with Walid Faris, but in our Syrian Democratic Coalition that includes Kurds, includes Christians, and even some Alawites and Sunnis and others that don't want theocracy. From 3 months into the revolution, we knew our families who have been suffering in Damascus and in Aleppo and all these cities in Syria for over 40 years knew that there was no political solution. There will never be a political solution in Syria. That regime will only leave by force, and ultimately America needs to take sides. The president finally got it right in August 2011 and said that there needed to be regime change, and now because Assad and his military have dug their heels in, it's basically brought about what we were concerned about, which is the radicalization of the Syrian population. And this is not to say that they've become a majority radical, but they've been left with nothing but the Al-Qaeda groups that have come into Syria. Most of them are foreign. Some of them were let out of the prisons by Assad, who used their release to say that, well, look, I've got this enemy now and I have to do this. And through his propaganda that he releases, legitimizes the murder of over 100,000 people. So ultimately there's been this third pathway, as you mentioned, which is in the Free Syria Army. And I say, my litmus test is easy, is if they're there to fight a jihad against Assad, they're not our allies. If they're there for freedom, to be free, be able to have institutions of civil society and be able to actually have legitimate elections and newspapers and free media. There are many Syrians that our families, many of whom are expatriates, came to Europe or America that have families back. Remember, the uprising in Syria, the biggest numbers for Al-Qaeda are about 10,000 from Israeli intelligence. The Free Syria Army is about 100,000. And that's not to say some studies, 30-40% of them may be Islamists that are not our allies. But yet the Syrian uprising is 10 to 15 million Syrians that are either providing food and water for the armies, that are working with at least not showing up for the draft that the military is having. Military's been calling every week, trying to call 2,000 to 3,000 Syrians, and nobody's showing up. They have 5 to 10 show up. So the only reason Assad is surviving is the troops coming from Iran, the money and oil coming from Iran, and Russia also. So, this is a conflict that we need to help tip in the right direction. There's no doubt that when Assad leaves, it's going to be a mess. This is what he left. The mess is not only 2 years of a mess, but 45 years, as we're seeing in Iraq. The reason Iraq is a mess is 40-plus years of dictatorship leaves no civil society organizations and leaves it chaos. But that can't be an excuse for helping dictators continue to smother a population.
And we're looking at a situation in which the Egyptian military obviously is combating Muslim Brotherhood organizations and now potentially some Al-Qaeda affiliates in Sinai as well. People are ignoring the fact that there's actually a war going on in the Sinai Peninsula that the Egyptian military is doing. The Egyptian military seems to be very opposed to support by the West for action against for action against the Syrian regime, and I think people are getting very confused as to what's going on in different countries as far as how to tip. Either how to tip the balance or whether or not we can even get involved. The opposition to involvement in Syria that I've seen is overwhelming. I don't know if you're seeing that where you are, but when I talk to people here, I get this idea that there's no reason that anybody that we should involve ourselves at all. Our congressional leaders certainly don't seem interested in it.
Well, unfortunately, I think you're exactly right, and it's almost in many ways oddly bipartisan in that the right have become sort of the isolationists of this discussion, and the left, in many ways, part of the anti-military part of the left, have not wanted to be involved. As a result, there seems to be a majority that look upon Syria as sort of the theory of let them kill each other, and I find that really un-American, to tell you the truth, Rabbi. If you look in history, if the West does not stand up for freedom, does not help the underdogs in fights, then who will? You're leaving Syria to devolve into a Darwinian evolution of the most vicious who will win. And you have both sides that are evil fighting right now, and you have a third side, which is the moderates within the Free Syria Army that need arming. Right now you have Qatar and Saudi Arabia arming the rebels, which are not going to be using the same litmus tests. They don't care if they arm jihadists, and this is why Syria is seeing an increase in the jihadists and those who want the Islamic State. So any way you look on it about American interests in the region, Syria is not a civil war. Definitely it started that way, but with Russia and Iran and Hezbollah constricting on all sides and helping Assad survive, to say that that's a civil war only is absurd. So there are definitely American regional interests. Israeli interests are on not only on their border, but the empowerment of an unhinged Iran and Hezbollah is the last thing Israel needs for its own security. And ultimately, certainly the chemical weapons are an issue, but to say that delaying another year where the chemicals start getting moved around and we inventory them while Assad kills another 100,000 and radicalizes even more, where now the greatest terror factory in the world is Syria. So regardless of what you think that Al-Qaeda is somehow an enemy of Assad, Assad's dictatorship is creating by the dozens Al-Qaeda, and he knows that, and he uses it as a foil, and he uses it to justify carpet bombing of neighborhoods that he says in his interview with his pal Kucinich that somehow he's like a doctor cutting off a leg, and this is offensive. And ultimately, I think we need to develop a strategy. And I think Americans right now, they say 60% of Americans a month ago didn't know where Syria was on a map. And we need to go through an educational process. If we had started this, Rabbi, over 2 years ago, I think Americans would be at a different place. It took President Clinton, I think, 3 to 4 years before he had the popular support to do something in Bosnia. And that was after 250,000 lives when Americans started to realize what was happening. I participated in Operation Restore Hope in Somalia as a medical officer, and I remember we were wondering what we were doing there, and we called it the CNN war because of American public looking at the starvation in Somalia. So I think ultimately if the coverage had been balanced, if the coverage had been more prevalent rather than just a few reporters here or there, and then you sort of get the Syrian side and Americans think that it's Al-Qaeda against Assad, sure, they're going to throw their hands up. But if you look at the informed American public, most of them realize that it's in our interest to do something. I do want to touch on one thing which you mentioned, which was Egypt. The Egyptians were much smarter than Assad in the way they approached this. They sort of sacrificed Mubarak up front and said that they were the beacons of democracy for Egypt. We can't forget what these parties are. The military party in Egypt is the NDP, the National Democratic Party, which is a socialist, nationalist, fascist party. Certainly they're more stable and more allies with us than the Brotherhood ever would be. So I was definitely for not necessarily what I would call a coup, which it technically was a month ago or 2 months ago, but rather a course correction for democracy. But there will be no democracy if the military stays controlling Egypt. Ultimately, the millions that rose up against the people that rose up against the government there rose up both against the Brotherhood and the deep state of the Egyptian military. And that's why they don't want us to intervene in Syria, because they know right now the military rules in the Middle East are on life support. And once Assad leaves, it's going to be like dominoes. The next will be the Gulf state monarchies. And ultimately, people rule is ultimately the Egyptian military will have to be run by the civilian government. It's going to be a long transition. And this is why the answer to this whole discussion, Jeffersonian democracy is not going to be turned on like a light switch in the Middle East. There has to be a transitional process over 5 to 10 years where militaries like Egypt's transition out towards civilian control, and Syria is going to be a longer one because of the devastation that we're seeing the military is leaving on its way out.
Now, in Egypt, how do you get to the point where you can transition to democratic rule without bringing the Muslim Brotherhood back in? If they that I guess was the hope to begin with, and we're in a situation in which that didn't really happen. The Muslim Brotherhood took over, and everything got even worse. I guess the fear is that giving democracy or creating democracy that's going to be taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood wherever they are because of their political machinery, will end up with one man, one vote, one time. How do you avoid that in Egypt or in Syria going forward?
That's the $1 million question, and ultimately my answer to that is what 60-plus years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak could not do to defeat the Brotherhood, which actually they fueled them through making them martyrs and victims. 1 year of Brotherhood rule woke up the people, marginalized them politically, and ultimately was the biggest defeat that the Brotherhood had. Now, you're right. I think any party which advocates violence, which advocates terrorism, should not be legal. Should not be a political party, because that is chaos, and that's our own American standard. But I think, look at our American standards. Clearly the Communist Party in America is not compatible with our Constitution, but yet we survive by allowing them to be legal, marginalizing them with the antiseptic of sunlight, and they are a fringe, insignificant party. And I think similarly in Egypt, I'm against making the Brotherhood illegal as long as they condemn violence, because ultimately the vast majority of Muslims, when left to their own devices, if we can help build civil society and allow them to build civil society organizations, secular, liberal, democratic groups, and help unify those groups among just one or two or three at the most different ideas, that will displace the Brotherhood. Look at Tunisia. You have even a more moderate version of the Islamists, which is an oxymoron, but it's true in some ways, An-Nahda, which is running the government. The only reason, Rabbi, An-Nahda won the election in Tunisia was the secularists divided themselves into 70 different parties, from the communists to the socialists, all these different parties, and they really didn't figure out how to unify like we do in the West among just a few parties, so that you can have a more unified, pluralistic type of coalition to come to power. This is what we can help with. And if you look in Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union withdrew, Estonia and other governments, we helped build their civil societies. Our think tanks helped teach them how to have constitutional foundations for parties and a political system that have made them pretty successful for the most part. It's not perfect, but ultimately these are the types of things that you find this president, and even President Bush before him, have had no interest, it seems, in really doing. And we've been defining democracy as elections, when, as you say, that's not what democracy is. Democracy defined as elections is actually, that's not. That's what's the old saying from Ben Franklin? It's 3 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. And that's not what's going to be successful in Egypt. It needs civil society movements and a strategy where we're not only dumping money through USAID for food and economy, but into helping them build political and think tank infrastructures.
Now, one question I have, and you pointed this out, I think it's important for people to understand. What do you consider the American interest in Syria?
I think our interest in Syria is that, left to its own devices, currently the vacuum that's being filled by the decrease in power by Assad is being filled by two sides. It's become a Sunni-Shia battle, where the Shia side is being filled by Iran, one of the world's largest sponsors of terrorism, Hezbollah, part of Iran's network and a terrorist organization, and Russia, which is a corrupt, mafia-like government that really just takes the highest bidder and really will do anything to take away Israel and America's interests in the Middle East, and is still operating under the Cold War premise, which my grandfather was fighting and being very anti-communist in Syria, which ended him up in jail, which is why he didn't support the Ba'ath Party and all of these nationalistic fascist groups that were very allied with Russia. The other side of the Sunni equation is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Brotherhood. And this is who is supporting the rebels right now. So left alone, this is a Darwinian paradigm that has no American interest or Israeli interest involved. So we can help the third parties, which would be women's groups, liberal groups, secular groups from the Free Syria Army, which really are still, if you look at the generals running the Free Syria Army, whether it's General Riyadh or other leaders, they're secular for the most part. Now, the Islamists are increasing in influence, but I think we can, if you want to see a Syria evolve out of those two different paradigms, it's going to have to be, and I think it's an American interest to have a role in that. Because even if, and I still think even without American support, it may take 500,000 lives or 1 million lives, that third party is going to win. Because the millions of Syrians that I know are not allied with either side. But if they win, they're not going to be very pleased to work with America or the West in the future as we let them die and suffer. So I think it's in our interest to prevent this factory of terrorism that's coming out of Syria, to help tilt them towards that third pathway.
Now, Dr. Jasser, I know that American Islamic Forum for Democracy has been working on trying to empower moderate Muslim groups. And you and I have had this conversation more than a few times about how Reform Judaism rose in the 19th century in Europe, and getting to the point where the religious leaders obviously were devotees of the traditional branches of the traditional Judaism at that point in time. How do you deal with the fact that you have imams that obviously are trained in traditional Islam and who are trained, especially in foreign countries, to support this idea of mosque and state together? Who do you work with, and how do you promote that idea of separation of mosque and state, not only within the United States and local communities, but how do you do that overseas?
That's a great question. I think actually, paradoxically, it's in some ways easier to do it overseas because, when I talk to American Muslims, many of them love our work, and I think a majority do, but they find it unnecessary for them to stick their foot in the water and help us because they're like, well, we're 1% of the population in America, barely 3-4 million, and it's 300 million people. So, we're never worried about Sharia running government. We're never worried about the Brotherhood. Yeah, they're running the mosques for the most part, but, many of the Muslims that support what we do either have become estranged from some of their local mosques or, just go for the holidays and Friday prayer, but are not that engaged. So in the Middle East, however, you saw the largest demonstrations in humanity against the Brotherhood that had initially gotten its power under Mubarak from the mosques, where they engaged that network and built. This is why once Mubarak left, they were able to mobilize elections and parties and activists and get the vote out through their mosque network. And ultimately also the petrodollars, which have fueled this whole network globally, where the Saudis, even though they claim to be antagonists with the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda, they have fueled the ideologies that feed this, which is based on the supremacism of the Islamic State. So how do we get to where AIFD wants to be? I would tell you it's a two-step process. One is to realize that the ideas about the separation of mosque and state are not being, I'm not creating these whole cloth out of nothing. There are imams, and I've talked to you about them before, whether it's Muhammad al-Ashmawi, Fatima Mernisi, who is a reformist who's well knowledgeable about Islam from Morocco. You've got so many different scholars that exist. President Wahid out of Indonesia, who's talked about the illusion of the Islamic State. So there are a lot of leaders. The problem is that I would tell you that the writing of new Sharia, a new school of thought, if you will, which is necessary right now. All four major schools of thought in Islam basically may differ on some of how moderate you can be regarding diet and dress and other things, but they're all going to be pretty much the same when it comes to the Islamic State and the mixture of a lot of the legalisms of these schools of thought into government. But the new school of thought will come, I think, after a two-step process. The first step that I think can happen in my lifetime, which we already saw in Egypt, which is mass movements that tell the imams and tell the religious institutions, you have no place in government. You can bring your ideas into government if you wish, your feeling of love for Islam, love for God, but our governments will be neutral to religion and will be under God, and you will have to argue your ideas in government based on reason, like we did in the West post-Enlightenment, versus not bring Sharia other than personal Sharia in your life. And then what will happen is once these types of Muslim groups run government and those parties run government and start building universities and schools, then those imams that support these ideas can start to have the power system to develop new schools of thought. Because right now, we can't take on the petro lobby from Qatar, which just bought a network in the West for $500 million, which is buying universities from Harvard to Georgetown to universities in the Middle East. We can't compete against that infrastructure. But what we can do, marginalize them in the power systems and the governments where they were in bed with dictators in the Arab League, and the OIC was being run either by secular dictators that were two sides of the same coin of radical Islam. Once you remove them from power and government, then those governments will start to create secular institutions that are truly liberal, that can start to help organizations like ours. And domestically, I would call upon you and other thought leaders and government and congressmen and women and media to push American Muslims to lead this. We should be the head of the spear when it comes to liberal ideas among Muslim populations. But because this government, our government in America, and our media doesn't want to use the term Islamic, doesn't want to take on and simply, backs down to the pressure of CARE, we have not and the Council on American Islamic Relations, we've given Muslims a pass in America about whether they're Islamist or not, and thus they've not been able to lead the reform globally.
And I heard recently, I think, that CARE changed its name. I heard something about it being the Washington Trust Foundation or something like that now.
Yeah, it's part of their shell game, as has been described, about how they move funds around between 501c3 and 501c4s, and when they get in trouble, they didn't file their 501c3 tax forms for 3 or 4 years. They were not able to get tax deductible donations, and those tax forms still have not been filled. So some of the buildings they own, you can go to careobservatory.com and look at some of their assets and who owns them. So they have solicited. They even sent a letter to Gaddafi in 2009 that was translated by the Investigative Project that showed they called one of the nuttiest dictators of all time. They called him His Excellency and representative of Islam because they look for money wherever they can get it, it seems, based on that letter. And it's interesting, they just put out 2 days ago a report on quote-unquote Islamophobia, where they identified people who they think are bigots on Islam. And the crazy thing about this, Rabbi, is they listed me and our organization and our coalition of reformists as being anti-Islam, when in fact they equate being anti-CARE as being anti-Islam. And ultimately it shows, they even quote something where I said, operationally Islam is not peaceful, and I had actually explained in that same speech, which today Dan Greenfield at Front Page Magazine talks about the reality of how dishonest that quote is from them, where in that speech I talk about how it's a battle within Islam, and that the liberals need to win this against the Islamists and the Brotherhood, because the Islamists are speaking for Islam and they operationally are not peaceful. But the way I practice my faith and teach my kids, I believe it is compatible with the West. So unfortunately, I've been left to fight this with my colleagues who are reformist Muslims almost by ourselves. And, we've not gotten a lot of the platforms necessary to displace CARE and other groups that get foreign funding and are really part of the OIC movement globally, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And ultimately, I think Americans are slowly waking up. We need them to wake up a little quicker to help us displace the influence of CARE.
And this gives me the opportunity to introduce something else that I was thinking about. There's this idea that the bad treatment of Muslims generally, whenever it occurs, is about Islamophobia, and it seems to me that the fear of Muslims as terrorists versus criticism of Islamic practices by some of these groups. And it seems to me that we need to differentiate that conversation, that somebody who's advocating for the oppression of women or something like that is different than somebody who's being who's talking about fear of terrorists. And this makes it very difficult, I think, even within the Muslim community to talk about these things. If any criticism of any Muslim organization qualifies as Islamophobia, or any criticism of any Muslim practice, even by Wahhabis, qualifies as Islamophobia, we have an impossibility of dialogue.
Exactly. And this is their goal. This is their goal. It is to prevent dialogue that would then lift the veneer of denial that they have, that we have any problems within the ideology. I mean, look at, for example, the recent bombings in Kenya and the attacks and the killing of over 60 in Westgate Mall. They condemn the terror act, but see if you can find CAIR's condemnation of al-Shabaab. You'll find they have individuals like Dawood Walid who actually refused to call Shabaab a terrorist organization and felt that they're a legitimate organization against the Somali government. And ultimately, this is the issue, is that they only want to deal with the act of terror and not with the ideologies that fuel them. And if we were to dissect through that mixture of theology with political institutions and governments that these groups seek to institute and implement by force, they just disagree with the method. This was the conflict between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda. The Brotherhood was very upset with Al-Qaeda in 9/11 because it outed its long-term goals, which were pretty similar, which was the creation of the Islamic State. And CAIR will never condemn the Islamic State. They'll continue to try to deceive Americans that it's about Islam is like democracy, is like the Constitution, and all this other nonsense where unless you separate mosque and state, there's no way to reconcile Islam with democracy when it comes to Sharia and other theocratic tools and instruments that they have. And I'll tell you, I don't use the term Islamophobia because it's nonsensical. Phobia is a fear, an irrational fear. Islam is an ideology. It's not a human being or a race per se, which they try to make it into. So the term itself is one that was imposed. It started not with CAIR. It started with the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is basically, Rabbi, a neo-caliphate. So that's not a conspiracy theory. It's 56 countries that have nothing in common other than the fact that they have Muslim-majority countries where, if left to their own devices, many of them hate each other, but yet they came together for one thing, which is to fight the West, put the West on the defense, put non-Muslim countries on defense so that they can come together and figure out how to advance Islamism. And they've been using the Arab awakening not to, they're finding that the dictators that formed the OIC are starting to lose the hold, but they're saying, well, let's use this as a mechanism to advance political Islam and even put the West even more on the defense. And you're right. They, by virtue of putting us in the West on the defense, preventing a dialogue about the theocratic or theological ideas that need modernization, they have then pushed it into simply what we call now in the White House and elsewhere violent extremism, which I don't even know what that is. When I've testified to Congress and elsewhere, I kept getting pushed into this conversation about violent extremism that could mean anything from inner city violence to God knows what, and there's no way to have a treatment of a diagnosis you can't pin down. And this is what they're trying to do to prevent, because once you dissect through the violent extremism, you're going to always get to the core problem, which is political Islam and the Islamist movement, which CAIR is a central part of. And we have to wake up that their implementation of the Islamophobia card is their main defense, and they're going to continue to push it as long as they can until we wake up to the fact that it's a deception.
I don't want to ignore the opportunity to have you tell the audience what organizations you see as being ones that should be supported. CAIR obviously is a Muslim Brotherhood organization and is advocating for things that we don't necessarily support. But what organizations other than yours do you think that people should be supportive of?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And that's why we formed our American Islamic Leadership Coalition. People can go to – we have a very rudimentary website for the coalition right now since we're all, running our own organizations. But it's AmericanIslamicLeadership.org, AmericanIslamicLeadership.org. There are over 20 Muslim leaders listed there, including the American Islamic Congress run by Zainab El-Suwaid, who was really highlighted and grew quite a bit during the Iraq conflict, and has been not only an advocate for moderate Islam but for women's rights, and I would ask people to look closely at her organization. Tariq Fatah with the Muslim Canadian Congress is a very moderate organization that has worked with us out of Toronto. There's also Holland Taylor with Lib for All, is a very moderate organization out of Indonesia, which was founded by former President Wahid. Again, it's about liberty. The book, The Illusion of the Islamic State, was highlighted and translated into English through that organization. Other leaders, Tawfiq Hamid, and a number of others that I'd ask people to look at AmericanIslamicLeadership.org, and other moderates that exist and have testified. For example, Chairman King, Peter King, when he was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, brought a number of us to testify to Congress about it. And I'd ask people, truly the moderate Muslims will be the ones that recognize that we need to condemn the doctrine of jihad and change that doctrine, that recognize reform is necessary, that recognize the need to counter Islamism or political Islam.
Now, we didn't really get to Iran. I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about Rouhani and what you perceive as the development of change in Iran, if there is change in Iran, and also a little bit on how the Sunni world is reacting to the Shia world and that conflict.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important because a lot of the conversation about Iran has revolved around the nuclear question, which certainly from a security perspective, short term is the primary issue. But the deeper issue is this, one of the same things we've been discussing, you and I, now since the program began, which is, remember, Iran had a green revolution that this president turned his head away from. After a couple of weeks, all of a sudden we weren't paying attention to it, and the Green Revolution went away. And there is definitely, I think, if you're going to see a peaceful Middle East, it'll have to be through regime change in Iran. And to think that somehow a moderate can come out of the Supreme Council of Iran and the clerics that are in control there is just absurd. Any moderates that exist are removed from the ballots. Any candidate that remains on the ballot there is simply, just as Prime Minister Netanyahu described, it changes the clothing of the wolf, may appear more like a lamb, but the bottom line, it's the same wolf, and actually I think can be more dangerous because he's a little bit more artful and deceptive in the way that he presents himself. And I would tell you, actually, if you look at Iran's recent overtures about, we're going to stop nuclear ambitions and we would want to engage, which isn't even been shown yet, they took their cue from President Obama, who basically, and Secretary Kerry, who within a week reversed the Assad policy from being one of punishment and degrading of their military to being one of engagement and taking a year to possibly move around chemical weapons. And they said, wow, look, our ally here, we've helped this dictator survive, and by doing so, we have been able to engage America through this dance and somehow fooling them into thinking that if we can promise things, that we can delay things while we continue to have our centrifuges spin and other things happen underground that nobody pays attention to. So I think Iran's as big a threat as it's ever been. We need to have a policy of regime change there and talk about how to help the good groups, the good guys and gals on the ground there that are working in women's organizations and civil society groups, etc. This needs to be the region. President Obama's legacy is going to be, Rabbi, that he had no doctrine in the Middle East. Every president had a doctrine. President Bush had a freedom agenda. And I would say, the Middle East needs a liberty doctrine. And ultimately, the problem is, and you actually raised the issue with the Sunni-Shia conflict. What's going to happen after you have 2 generations of dictatorships in every Muslim majority country, especially in the Arab world and with Iran beyond the Arab world, when you remove that pressure cooker, that stew is just going to explode. And part of that explosion is going to be tribal sectarian battles, and that's what you're seeing happening in Bahrain with Sunni-Shia conflict, where the Sunni minority was running. That's what you're going to see happen in countries that were the nexus of crossroads, which is really what Syria was, is a crossroads. But in those crossroads is, I think, the opportunity. Syria was an opportunity. It had much less of a control of the Brotherhood than Egypt ever did. And it was an opportunity for a government that could have been Christian, Alawite, Kurdish, Sunni, Shia, all of these, and yet that opportunity's been lost by having no policy and letting that vacuum get filled, as we've talked about. So, you know, in Iran, similarly, advocating for the rights of the Baha'is, of Christians who have to go underground. Religious freedom opportunities are being lost from the bully pulpit of the White House, while we see a minister like Abdini, who's been in jail now for over a year in the worst prison, and you hardly see a word from the White House. You see the Secretary of State mention a few things, but we've had so many opportunities that we've lost, and if we continue to stay silent, those opportunities are going to get filled by even worse options.
And I agree completely, and we see that the United States is not really maintaining a credible military threat, if at all, I mean, even remotely credible, in dealing with the Iranian nuclear situation. Certainly didn't with the Syrian chemical weapons situation. But we also didn't respond to Turkey's government, to Erdogan, arresting the opposition leaders there. I mean, there seems to be a pattern of not doing anything to stand up for people who would be our allies in these situations. Do you see that?
Absolutely, and we have lost the courage of our convictions. And it's interesting that despite the lack of leadership from Obama, still the world has continued to look to the president and the United States to be the advocates for freedom, which is what our branding and our history has always been. And hopefully at some point we will wake up to the fact that we are the response and the fill-in, if you will, to help the liberals and the majorities of these population find a voice for the people, and that our diplomacy needs to change from being sort of the lesser of two evils to being a policy that advocates for the people. Because right now, you know, you talk to the ambassador in Egypt, and she'll tell you, Ambassador Patterson will tell you, well, you know, both sides hate us. You know, they think we're with Mubarak, and then they think we're with the Brotherhood, and well, the reason they do is they don't hear us talking about being with the people. They don't hear us talking about being with women's groups and with the democratic movements that are really truly for liberal values. We've not made that distinction. We actually still, the president last week in a press conference in Europe said we won't take sides internally. That's absurd. You can't get the favor of populations that agree with us in the way we interpret the Universal Declaration of Human Rights if we don't start taking some sides. Not too much politics, but at least some sides for those that advocate human rights and believe in democracy. And I'm going to leave you with one thought. I talked to an Iranian reformist who told me, they said that when the reason you're seeing the ascension and the total unhinging of the theocrats in Iran is because the only thing they respond to is strength. When they see America weak, when they see us basically doing a double talk and a back talk and sort of trying to engage them, that tells them they can do whatever they want, and they push forward and help Syria, help Hezbollah. When they see us respond with strength and actually mean that we may use military might and actually say that we're going to help with regime change, that pushes them back. That's the only language the thugs in Iran, the thugs in Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere will understand is strength behind the language of liberty, and we have not done that.
Dr. Jasser, it's been wonderful having you on Understanding the World today, and we hope that our viewers will take a look at AIFdemocracy.org and to follow Dr. Jasser, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser on Twitter, and to pay attention to all the things that you put out, the organization puts out, because we really do need to be advocating for real moderates around the world. And I hope at some point in the future when things come up, I'd love to have you on the show again. We have wonderful conversations, and I think certainly in my heart to help you promote what you do, not only in the United States, but around the world.
Anytime, Rabbi. The platform that you have is fantastic, and we're just blessed to be able to bring our message to you. And thank you for all that you do. And we look forward to joining you anytime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. That's been Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman.